And welcome back. We are here with Eve Intersected on our fourth episode that we'll have. We started speaking with Ryanne in our first episode around her experience with sport, lacrosse in particular, and we got into family and connection and wonderful discussion around the calls to action as well. And then following that, I had a really wonderful conversation with some folks from the sport industry. So I spoke with Dean Smith and Brad Taylor from the Hockey Nova Scotia organization, and we ran through their experiences with the calls to action, as well as Marc St. Pierre from Ottawa Sport and Entertainment Group. So two wonderful conversations where Kay and Ryanne weren't sitting in that space with us. And so what we're doing today is, in this episode, we're coming back, and Kay and Ryanne have had a chance to listen to some of that commentary that we had with those two groups. And we're now just going to riff a little bit in terms of how we feel and what does that look like and what do we think moving forward. So
the fun stuff.
Yeah, the fun stuff. This is the feelings bit that's really embedded in what we do here with Eve Intersection and the connections and how we're feeling about things. So I'm just going to throw it out. What did you think when you were listening to these episodes?
Well, I first want to say hello, everybody. Kay here, Eve Intersected. Ryanne, we're so happy to have you back with us. And I just want to thank you for what we did previously, because it was really nice to put a human touch, a human lens on the calls to action. And really, really, it motivated me in a different way. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here again.
Yeah. It was such a wonderful feeling when we left the room after that first episode, like just something that you can't really explain, but definitely left us with a lot to think about for sure.
So that's exactly what I was thinking. We left her with a lot to sit with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what are you thinking? How are you feeling? What was coming out for you in those episodes? And then we'll talk about some specific things that we have notes on, but like, what's the initial thought?
Overall, listening to those episodes, it was interesting. Like, it was cool to see various organizations and how they approach things and the different mechanisms that they use, I guess, to interact with community or try to work towards these calls to action. Yeah, just they were unique, I would say. Mm-hmm. I don't want to get too deep into it, but...
They were definitely very unique conversations, and even like at the very core, just being in two different parts of our industry. So we have a nonprofit organization that works for different objectives, and then a for-profit organization that's relatively large. So it's like, if you think of all the arms within Ottawa Sport and Entertainment Group, we're saying, okay, intuitively they're going to be different, but how they were different was really interesting to hear and what was going on.
For me, I was just so exhilarated and so encouraged to think that there are spaces that are doing this radical, progressive, I guess it shouldn't even be considered radical, progressive work. I was just overjoyed. I was excited listening to them. It was very, very cool. I doff my hat to both of those organizations. And I guess the key for me is, man, how do we bring some of that here? Yeah. How do we bring some of that energy that really resonated? Yeah. It carried through. I felt it. Like, I felt like I held it.
Yeah, you're sitting in that space, right? Yeah. And I think it came back to when we talked with you, Ryanne, about your experience. I think if I'm thinking back to how I was interpreting things and sitting here, we're sitting in the same space, so I can almost feel it, is this idea of connection and authentic relationships and the core of how we see sport generally. I felt that, and I'm going to peel back to not the organizations, and I'm going to say these three individuals that I spoke to had that. I felt that relationships mattered to them, and I think that was a key to what we were talking about and what I got in terms of the feeling.
Yeah, definitely. I think and I think I might have like a bias input on this, but I think when I did go into those episodes, that was something that I was looking to hear for. And so particularly, I think with the Nova Scotia organization, I was really impressed with just the way that they worded like they were cognizant of the way that they were speaking. They were using, good terminology. They were putting an emphasis on not them, but the communities around them. And that was something that kind of went beyond what I was expecting when you kind of think of these bigger organizations. So that was really nice to hear, for
sure.
Yeah.
There were a lot of really important things that I came out with. I echo what you're saying, Ryan. There was so the way I was thinking about it is, you can't fake the funk. Organically and inherently, this is part of how they live and see the world now. Like, that's a lens for me that I don't think you can put on for size. It's either part of what you prioritize or not. And so for me, I was taking that example, like, okay, you can't dip your toe in the pool. You got to jump all the way in. And that's what they've done. And I think that's what differentiates themselves from other spaces that may not be, but have the potential to come off as seeming performative, because it feels like you're dipping your toe in the pool as opposed to jumping in to an immersive experience.
Yeah. And I think it really exemplifies this difference between, are we just addressing the calls to action, or are we embedding this sense of collective action in who we are as an organization? And from this, I'm biased too. I think of bias because I sat on these calls with these people and I'm thinking, wow, I've already feel a connection or relationship with them through a video recording. I can only imagine what people are feeling with them in those spaces. And I'm going to turn a bit of attention to Dean, because Dean is a volunteer. So this is another distinction on these calls, right? So Marc, paid staff. Brad, paid staff. Certainly the work they're doing is really relevant. But if I think of Dean's role, he's a volunteer. He was on a task force, which is sort of an arm's length piece to the organization, but now is embedded in the board. But we think of the wonderful role of our volunteers when we say, what are we bringing to our sport organizations? And I know we can really, there's a lot of layers in terms of what Dean was talking about in terms of his own experience, how he connects. But were there any feelings that you had around just the way in which a volunteer, and a volunteer like Dean specifically, is contributing to the way in which this organization is engaging in the calls to action?
People like Dean, for me, are rare in this world, because just from listening to that recording, what became clear was he turned passion into purpose.
Yeah.
It seemed like all of his initiative was informed by his lived experience. And that was so profound for me.
Yeah.
And again, it's the difference between dipping your toe in that pond and jumping into a fully immersive experience. He is immersed within that ecosystem and that space with purpose and intention. And I just can't say enough. Like, I was so moved in listening to that, in understanding and appreciating the breadth of impact that he has. I just can't say enough. So I'm going to put a pin in it here.
Yeah. No, I agree with that sentiment completely. And you can also tell just in the way that, not even what he was saying in the podcast, but from what you just said, how he is contributing his time, he's living this experience. You can tell that it's not just about him as well. Like, he's doing this for community. He's doing this for people who have had experiences similar to him. Like, yeah, I think that is a big part of it. Like, of what I took out of it was that you can tell he is a deeply profound, like, good person because he's doing all of this, but he's not asking for anything in return. And I think that's a really big part to that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that insight.
Yeah. That's really important. I'm sitting with that for a second just to think about how I was seeing Dean in that moment, and you're hitting it on the head, is that he is so aware of what the needs of others are and how he's contributing and what that means without this sort of necessity for anything in return. It's just that power of giving is what is motivating him. And it's a part of this overarching theme of what we talked about prior to the show of saying, okay, how do we make these calls to action and this work sustainable, is seeing how we build those authentic connections. Yes. Important who we place in the room with us. And when we've talked about this with Eve Intersected, this idea of inclusion is so important. And it's not to exclude, it's inclusion.
To create more space.
More space for folks. And I see that in what Dean does, in his role and connection and understanding what other people need and how he's creating that space and saying, okay, we need a position on this board of directors that's specific here in our context. So that's what we're going to move to create and the action behind it.
Absolutely.
Then he said, I think we need this and I'm going to make it happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. So to pick up on that sustainability piece that you talked about, I think in order for anything to be sustainable, what I learned from that interview with Hockey Nova Scotia was that they value relational approaches.
Yeah.
Right? They recognize that the power is inherent in the relationships and that meaning is created in relationship together. It's a way of thinking, right? It's a framework. It's a lens you put on, and either you buy into it or you don't, but they buy into it. And I think that is an important piece there for sustainability. It's valuing authentically the community that you're in relationship with. Some things they did very well. Continuity was very important to them of their Indigenous athletes, making sure that the programs they were embedded in, once this one ended, that there was another natural connector so they could continue to grow and develop. I thought that was amazing. Evaluation as key. Right? Yeah. We learn all the time in our courses here in sport management that, if you have a program but you're not evaluating the program, it's not as effective as it possibly could be. So some of these theoretical pieces that they were flushing out realistically were really impressive. But again, at the top of that for me was recognizing the value and the power inherent in relational approaches. Yeah. Key to sustainability, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think the other piece, too, is how many organizations they list off that they're working with. It's the value of, and if the audience here might be students, is thinking, well, who do I have to connect with if I'm going to make this work? And who should I be connecting with? And there was, I think, at least a list of 6 that I had that was saying, now it's not just sport organizations. We're looking at the Immigration Nova Scotia. We're looking at connecting with other community members. And so really recognizing the power of those authentic relationships don't stay in a bubble. And I think this is where I kind of see a natural link into what Marc was talking about, where we're thinking about belonging, and we can unpack belonging a little bit in the next, as we sit here together. But that's this idea of, okay, we're adding belonging now from the OSEG, Ontario or Ottawa Sport and Entertainment Group perspective in the acronym DEI. But what does that mean for them? And you felt it a bit, but it wasn't unpacked a lot in terms of how we were discussing.
How do you operationalize belonging?
Yeah, what does belonging look like, and what does that mean to add that term to an acronym that already exists and is a bit contentious right now in our whole political landscape across North America? So what does this mean to add belonging?
I think that is a really good drawn out connection that you made, because I did have one thing that I particularly liked that connects back to what you were just saying from Hockey Nova Scotia, and how they weren't just prioritizing making programs available to these communities or these youth, but making sure that the programs they're in with youth who also identify, they're in with their own community members. Yes. It's not just being thrown kind of into a random program just for the fact of saying, yes, there's program available, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But they're putting that extra step of effort into making sure that, okay, you're surrounded by people that look like you, that you identify with, that you can connect to beyond just playing the same sport as them. So I think that's a really good kind of example of that kind of belonging aspect, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, and my ignorance, I would call it, when we started this work, I was thinking, okay, these organizations are probably going to be creating their own programs that then they're going to expect folks to register. And similar to what you're saying, Ryan, is it could be anybody that registers. We're just trying to invite an Indigenous community, as an example, into that program. And then I'm learning, absolutely not. They're just in some cases supporting what's already being created and saying, let's provide resources and sustainable practices that are attached. And I thought, okay, wow. In both cases, it seemed like less so, but it was happening with Ottawa Sport and Entertainment Group was this idea of creating or supporting those organizations.
I was going to say, I was very intrigued to that conversation about belonging because as I was thinking about it, I would operationalize belonging as integration into the organizational ecosystem, because you can be included in the organizational ecosystem, but not duly integrated. I would operationalize belonging as accessibility, and I would operationalize belonging as representation.
Yeah.
Now, briefly, and I would like to come back. I know that we've got some things we really want to prioritize to discuss, but I would like to come back to a conversation. I did a bit of a content analysis and just looking at the background of some of these organizations, and I would like to table some of that for us to converse about.
Okay, well, that's part of it. And I love that because of this conversation around belonging. And I think that's a piece to how we think about the way in which we might engage in sport. I mean, we all want to belong. We want to feel like we have a place around the table. And Ryan, I'm going to turn this back to the conversation we had in our first episode around what sport means to you and what lacrosse in particular meant to you in terms of where you felt or you have in the past felt safe and felt like you belong, and depending on where that sport was and where it was in your life. Does anything spark for you in terms of why belonging resonates so or had resonated so clearly to you when you were listening to some of the tapes?
Yeah, I think kind of returning back to something I talked about in our first episode, I think that aspect of belonging kind of comes into my love for lacrosse and how I got to loving lacrosse so much and getting so much into the game. Like, it was that feeling of belonging on that first team that I was a part of that I think made it stand out so much relative to any other sports that I had ever played or tried.
Interesting.
And it was like, and like, not ironically, but I guess coincidentally, that was also a team with majority Indigenous players. We were players from various nations. It was a smaller community center. And so we came together and it was majority Indigenous First Nations players with a minority of white European players. So that, I think, and it was never like cliquey. It was never like people were being, you're not this, so you can't hang out. Yeah, it wasn't like that. That was the thing, is like you might expect that, but that didn't happen with our group. It was never like that. It was always just sisterhood. We always just belonged to each other. We would fight for each other. We would play for each other. So I think that sense of belonging is really integral in like youth growing up in sport. I think that's a really big aspect of the sport in particular. And so, yeah, I'd say it really contributed to my longing to continue playing lacrosse rather than just like trying it out and getting not the greatest team, I'd say, to play with and then not really wanting to return back. Like, it was that, oh, these are my sisters. This is my family now, that made me want to come back. Like, I want to be a part of this. Like,
So if I may ask a follow-up question, not to put you on the spot, Ryan, but this is a philosophical thought that I haven't been able to escape since I started watching the recordings, listening to the recordings rather. So therefore, would you say insider status is important for a sense of belonging? To me, it is. If I may respond to that question first, I always think insider status is important. Like, you have to have somebody with insider status who is an expert in the lived experience of the community that you're seeking to serve. That's my bias, my points of view. I'm just wondering, what do you think about that?
I would say yes. I agree with that as well. Having that insider status anywhere you go always gives you that kind of booster, that level up, I would say. So having that, yeah, I would say that definitely influences wherever you're at. Like, ideally, it wouldn't.
Fair.
But it does.
Absolutely. I agree with you. So if I may use that as the launching pad to just engage this little content analysis thing I did.
Yeah.
So again, multiple things can be true at the same time because admittedly, these organizations are doing wonderful work. I take nothing away from them. But when I did a bit of a content analysis, what I realized was, so their public-facing website and the information that was available for everybody to look at, their board of directors at OSEG was one female amongst 7 males. So there are 8 board members in total, and there was one female. And then they did have a page that had pictures of their staff complement, which was really awesome because, that's very transparent. So in that, I made note of the fact that there were 5 staff members. There was 1 male on that complement, and they were all white appearing. There did not seem to be anybody of color on first glance, of course, not knowing anybody's backgrounds behind the screen. So that got me thinking. And it was a good open thought because it's like, man, these guys are doing really wonderful work. So does insider status matter?
Mm-hmm.
I wondered.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
This is like, one, you're speaking, I love the language of content analysis. So with our little researcher hat on, I love that. And part of this too is you're also speaking to my HR hat. So okay. I teach human resource management. And you're talking about, so we've kind of been really focused on, and so were the other episodes, we were focused on participants and programs and the athletes that are involved. But now we're like moving into the boardroom and where the decisions are actually being made. And I think that's really important for anyone that's trying to move into a space, and we're being actively pushed to be more diverse in our workplace and to have more representation. And this is where that piece of belonging, I think, really is important. So if we're being pushed, and I'm going to take my hat as a settler white woman, if I'm sitting in a space and I say, well, I've always felt like I belong here. Well, maybe when we talk about, I have a bit of an insider status because the room that I'm sitting in might be people who also identify as white individuals, and I'll leave gender aside for the time being. And so it's that reflection to say, okay, well, who's sitting in the room in the decision-making spaces for those where these decisions are being made? And if we think about the larger organization, it looks like perhaps we need to have a bit of a reflection on who's making the overall decisions. And then if we think of the folks that were sitting on the call with us and the diversity that was embedded in that, the folks that were sitting on those calls, we shouldn't be just putting all of this work on people who come with diverse intersecting identities. And that's another, it's just that constant reflection on, okay, now moving to the boardroom, who's making decisions? And we also still need to think about belonging in that space as well. So challenging us, challenging the listeners, our students who are listening, you are going to be the sport managers in this context. So really having that reflection on who is granted insider status, because we're talking about that does matter for belonging, for better or worse. Mm-hmm. And how do we open the doors to make that more inclusive on who has that insider status? Because given your content analysis, Kay, in a few contexts, that is right now seems to be narrow based on what we're seeing from a content space. So just challenging
both things being true, like the great work is being done, but and I don't really have the answer, but it just made me think more about this issue. Well, it's not even an issue. This insider status platform. Yeah, absolutely. Does it matter? And then you brought up a good point. In a lot of the work I do, and again, my point of view is predicated by the fact that I'm a Black woman. So it was hard for me not to see that because I'm always looking for that anywhere I go, quite frankly. And I think that's an important piece of information, like when we're talking about perspective taking, is understanding that minority people who live in a majority world, this is how we navigate the world, for better or worse. But it got me thinking about, in my experiences in academia, a lot of times when the suggestion is put out to invite Indigenous voices, the knee-jerk reaction that I have observed is a very compassionate one, I will say. It's one that articulates that my colleagues are overburdened. My Indigenous colleagues are overburdened as it is. I don't want to unduly place any more stress on them. I'm not Indigenous, so I can only speak from my perspective, but I dare say, I bet you those colleagues would welcome the opportunity to be overburdened by joyful work, by work that centers and reprioritizes themselves, right? But so for me, I feel like it's a colonized way we avoid engaging with our Indigenous faculty and staff and knowledge holders. Yeah. Brian, I just want to turn it to you. I've said a lot. What do you think?
I think you make some very interesting and relevant points, especially like going back to where kind of Shannon started, talking about like just that representation and like what is normalized and not normalized. When I go into a space personally as an Indigenous woman and I see Indigenous leadership, I get excited. Like this isn't something that has been the norm. So that is something for me that is, I think, different than potentially other non-Indigenous students who see representation in these leadership positions. So I think there are like these little,
I get that,
these differences in perspective that we don't think about, but that are happening and that are just kind of part of our everyday lives that people don't really consider. And then kind of transferring over to what you were talking about, Kay, it's interesting because you say our Indigenous knowledge keepers and leaders and professors are overburdened right now, which I've seen that as well. Like people ask a lot and it's positive, has positives and negatives because we're in this time where people are trying to kind of advance and like move forward in this space of reconciliation and decolonization. But at the same time, we're doing that of kind of overbearing our Indigenous leaders. But what you mentioned was really interesting about the whole, they might want to be involved in something that's positive, that's joyful to experience, where I feel like right now it's not really that thing. Like, and I don't know if it's intentional or if it's coincidental, but something doesn't feel right about the fact that Indigenous leaders are being put in these positions to deal with the harder, the challenging things that are more harmful, I guess, to get through. Whereas they're not as involved or being like involved as much from my own perspective. I don't know if this is the truth or the reality, but on the positive things or the joyful side, the things that people would want to see, you know, or be a part of. Yeah. I don't know. For sure. That's just what came to mind for me when you were speaking. And I was like, that's interesting.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And can I jump in here? Because this, like, from what you were both saying, it really tied back to, I really started to think a lot about Dean in this space and his role on this committee. And I just was taking some notes rapidly, so I'm going to look at them so I don't forget anything that what I was saying. Because, Kay, you hit it on the head. When I first connected with Dean, I had inaccurate and inappropriate assumption that, well, he's probably being overworked because right off the bat, I knew that he was a Black man in this space. So I knew how he identified and I thought, I think he's being overworked. And it almost had this, again, I'll label it as inappropriate. I got my backup for him. And then after I met with him, I was like, they are doing the work in this context where all of the relationships they've created, we come back to this authentic relationship piece. And those connections are years and years old. And he is doing this because it's joyful. You can tell he loves this work. And that's what I now may be encouraging everyone to think about who's listening, students, if you're a staff member, anyone trying to engage this work, is it's long term. Like this is like years and years of relationship building where now, and I'm not going to speak for Dean, but how I interpreted Dean's response is, he likes this work. He wants to do more. He's the one that suggested that there was a board of directors role and that he would be in it and that people surrounding him supported that. So thank you for bringing that up because it identified my gap in terms of how I was seeing things from my point of view, which as I've acknowledged several times, I'd have so much learning to do. But it's part of that is to say, okay, I had an assumption. It was crushed. Why might I have been wrong in that assumption? And then now I've learned from it. And so I think that's really, really important in this work. And the key to this is that this is such a long-term connection. It's not here at Brock as an example. We're going to change the world tomorrow. So let's push everybody to make the change, because I think that's where burnout for anything comes is when we're like, you need to do that yesterday and now you have no resources to do it, but we need you to do it. Can you do it? Can you put everybody on your back? And that's bound to fail. I feel like there's so many layers to that. So we don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But
but he characterized his work as unapologetic and proactive.
Yeah.
That resonated with me. Yeah. He said, because Indigenous communities deserve, it's been a long time coming, but they deserve rightfully were words he used. Yes. And I was just so moved.
Yeah. And thank you for pulling that out and like drawing people to that. Say, go back to that episode and really listen to, like, he was very intentional in how he spoke about things. Absolutely. Thanks, Kay. So if we're bringing this all back to where we started, so we've gone through episodes and conversation with sport organizations and their representatives who are doing really wonderful work. And we've talked to Ryan about your experience as an athlete, as an Indigenous woman in this space, and your history and your family. I mean, you're so wonderful in terms of being open with us. And this all comes back to where we started with identifying the calls to action. So large calls in terms of broad list of calls to action across education, across health, we're looking business, and then sport. So we land on calls 87 to 91 that are specific to sport organizations. And if we read those in depth, so we've talked about high level, these are about authentic relationships and recognizing and respecting the history of Indigenous culture, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous athletes, and really embedding the principles of understanding and respect and awareness and relationships into the sport programs we develop, how we engage in events that respect Indigenous athletes as well as Indigenous events specifically. But that leads us to thinking, we've talked a lot about participants, but if we're trying to engage in sport, how do we connect with some of these calls? How do we support Hockey Nova Scotia in their work? In Marc's interview or discussion on the podcast, he talked a lot about getting feedback from fans. So fans, as for a for-profit sport organization, really drive their wheel. So if I'm a fan and I'm sitting in the stands at an Ottawa Red Blacks game, how do I support what's happening in the movement towards these calls to action? Or how do we support that as we're fans of sport and we're engaging in this way? Do you have any thoughts on that space?
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. Thank you for that. In the Hockey Nova Scotia recording that I listened to, something else that resonated with me was when he clearly articulated that the Truth and Reconciliation is a call to action. It's not a recommendation. It is a call to action, to act. Yep. It is a living, breathing document. And so I really loved that he so formally characterized it. It really gave me a different sense, a heightened sense of the importance of acting, of doing things. So I just wanted to start there because he articulated that so well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very clear. What do you think, Ryan? If we're saying, okay, now we're going to ask people to do something. So the action piece of what Kay was talking about is there are these formal sport organizations and they have representatives talking about what they're doing. But if we're sitting in the stands or we're going to consume sport product, how do we think about these calls?
I would say a good first step is to just educate yourself. I think we are exposed to a lot of it now with people, bringing in, there's Indigenous Heritage Nights, there's different events, there's things that go on during like halftime shows or between periods of certain sports that are out there trying to get Indigenous culture embedded into sport and out there for people to see. But I think a lot of people don't quite know what's going on. And I think the best part or like the easiest way to kind of solve that is to educate yourself, like look into it. Like we all kind of have phones, like if you see something and you're not really aware of it, it's really easy nowadays to just Google it and find out more and like keep educating yourself on the issues that go on around you in your local regions, things like that, I would say is a good starting point at the very least.
Yeah. And awareness is a big part of the calls. They're embedded in more than one of the calls. And so that is a big piece of this as well, coming to what your point is. And And I think of even listening to how you were engaging in your conversation in the first episode, Ryan, like I was learning more about the meaning of lacrosse and how embedded in Indigenous communities lacrosse is, and for you in particular, what it meant. And then thinking about what sport meant in the residential schools and how we touched on that a little bit and how some would characterize it as an escape. And I think now, if I'm recalling, even Dean mentioned that because he worked with the TRC and he did some of his paid staff work with looking at the commission reports, and his comment around how sport was seen by some, not by all, as an escape from what was happening in the residential schools. And so challenging us to learn more and be open to information. And Kay, you and I have talked about this in previous episodes, this idea of the word woke and how it's being used in a negative way. And I think we need to reclaim it to say we're just awakening ourselves to more information. Let's be aware. Let's think about what we're seeing and consuming and how we're consuming.
Well said. Woke is welcome here, folks, just so y'all know.
And just to add to that is just like, it's like get comfortable being uncomfortable, I would say is a really, really good one for that. Like just adding to that sentiment is a lot of this work and this learning is very uncomfortable for a lot of people, myself included. Sometimes like it's hard to learn about, but you have to kind of sit in that uncomfort to be able to fully process and learn through that experience and like learn through what you're learning about. And I think that's something that a lot of people aren't really in tune with is like as soon as it's uncomfortable, people kind of push away a little bit. They don't really like it, which is natural. It's a natural response. But I think being uncomfortable is a really great way to challenge yourself to learn through these experiences.
Absolutely. And one of the things I'll draw on in a personal experience, so when I first addressed the calls to action, part of me, I moved myself away from sport and I focused more so on just learning a bit more. And I started to read more about residential schools. And part of that is when you read the horrific things that were happening there, it's uncomfortable, to your point. And I would stop reading and then force myself to read again, partly because of my privilege in that I can just walk away from that book and not have to do anything about it. But it's forcing yourself to say, no, this is important, so continue. And so that's like just more of a raw example of maybe somebody else is feeling that same way in the same space, maybe identifies in a similar way to me. I am getting a little bit emotional just because of the way you feel when you're uncomfortable is something that's what you have to wrestle. And that's where the real work is, right? It's like, okay, if you don't sit there and take it in, then you're not acting. You're not answering the calls to action in a meaningful way. So just challenging folks, if you're listening and you've been in that space, you're not alone. It is a place, no matter where you sit. And it's, you have to be comfortable with that discomfort and then wrestle with it and have these wonderful spaces where you can unpack that and connect with people. And that's the beauty of connection, is then you have relationships where you can sit and unpack these pieces. And I think that's an important piece as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Shannon. I was also going to say that when I was listening to the OSEG recording, they talked about embedding it in their strategic planning. All of their truth and reconciliation priorities surrounding sport. And I think that's important too, because you can't run from it once you've concretized it. Right? And so do we do that here? I don't know. I'm wondering. At Brock, is it involved in our strategic planning?
So there's definitely, go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, no, I think we are in the works of creating the first Indigenous strategic plan. Okay,
this is important information. Can you briefly, what's that all about?
As far as I know, it's still in the works.
Okay.
There is an advisory committee. I'm a part of that as well. It's, a really big step. It came out of Brock's new strategic plan that was released just earlier this year, I believe. And then shortly after, it was announced that Brock will be creating its Indigenous strategic plan.
Wow. Okay, so it's coming?
It's coming.
Wow, I didn't even know that when I asked the question, but I know I was wondering about that. Amazing.
Yes.
Good to know.
But you're right. And we circle back to how we started with this idea of longitudinal sustainability and creating authentic relationships that last is you have to build it into the fabric of the system. So at the beginning, we focus a lot more on the folks. Like, so we talked to Marc, we talked to Brad, we talked to Dean, and how they were embedded in these relationships. But I think back to both of your points is it has to also be in the institution. And so a part of the institution is the strat plan, which covers more than just one sort of little insular area. Fair. So I'd say this should be the fabric of Brock Institution.
Hear, hear.
The institution of Brock. And we should also see, I love that.
Did I say
that? and we heard it with Marc at OSEG is now it's not just one role. It's not just one department. It's now, this is something we talk about in our daily day-to-day operations. And then when we talk to Hockey Nova Scotia, even more progressive, I think, but maybe not more progressive, just in a different direction because it's a nonprofit. The amount of resources they put. So whether it's financial, human resources in the fabric of what they're doing is to say, we believe in this. So you have to support it. You can't just throw out ideas and then hope that they happen. There has to be some backing in order for it to be sustained. And so all of that is sort of the structure of what supports happening, whereas we focus a lot at the beginning of the episode around the people, which again is key when we think of relationship building, but the structure itself too. So I really appreciate that point, Kay, to say the strat plan, the strategic plan that we create is really important, and it'll show support.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the other thing I was thinking about in terms of bringing the calls to action, and it's something that we talk about in the class I'm teaching right now, and we discuss in seminar, it's the value and importance of perspective taking with respect to this work. Because, again, I always say both things can be true. What works for you may not work for me, but it's to my benefit to understand how it works for you, right? Because then I can be more open and responsive to your experiences when they happen. So I just want to put that out there for everyone to consider from a philosophical point of view. Two things can be true at any given moment. It doesn't always have to be one or the other. So consider challenging ourselves within that space of discomfort. Sometimes accepting that my point of view is but one of many, that's difficult too for some, right? Yep. So I think that part is also important, to always be challenging our penchant to be able to be flexible enough to assimilate, adopt, and make space for other perspectives other than our own.
Yeah. That's a really great point. And I think it comes back to, and I really went to just sitting in a space where you're with someone that might not necessarily feel the same way, and even opposite ends of the spectrum from where you're feeling. And that might be a space, if I'm drawing back to when we started talking about fans and our role as fans, like we might be sitting in a stadium where we see something and we don't necessarily agree with what we see. So if we peel back to Ottawa Red Blacks and they do the land acknowledgement at the beginning of the game before the anthem is played, is if you're sitting in the stands and someone is criticizing that, or there's some sort of having dialogue, like engaging in a thoughtful conversation with someone, pushing ourselves to maybe be a bit uncomfortable in that space, but that might happen. And that's the reality of the world that we're in. Like, I'm sitting in this really wonderful, safe space with folks that we have similar perspectives. We certainly will diverge in some areas, but we're also going to be sitting in spaces where we're on like complete opposite ends of someone else. And how are we handling that is, we need to be thoughtful. And as it comes back to relationship building, is we don't always have to agree, but at least have the conversation. And
absolutely.
Respectful conversation, I think, is really important as well. Yeah.
One point of feedback I had for the Nova Scotia organization was, and this comes through some of my committee work in engaging with transformative and decolonial frameworks, we've really interrogated the use of the word task force because it's historically connected to harm and pain. And so that was jarring for me in sight of all the wonderful work that was obviously spilling out of everywhere. It was just the use of the word task force. I would interrogate that for something that embraces equity-seeking language more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Part of it, too, is just some history between Kay and I. Kay taught me this probably about a year ago, maybe more. Time is really relative. But we're sitting in our lab and we were doing research on subcommittees within governance, and they were labeled as task force. So in my world, that is how they are labeled. And so it didn't even dawn on me that there was going to be any sort of negative connotation. And then kids, we're in a space, we have a lot of dialogue, says, you know what? Do you all know that this has a really negative connotation? And we didn't. And so that was part of it. And this is where we sort of put that call out to sport organizations, Hockey Nova Scotia, anyone doing this work, is just to think about the language that's being used. And again, it comes back to now we're learning. So conversations allow us to learn and grow.
That's right.
I now know, because I think I made a noise when you said, I was like, but I want to just articulate that I've not always been in the know. And this was learning through UK, is to say, okay, important conversation. And that's definitely a term that if you do some digging, you do some reading, there's history behind why there's negative connotation attached to the word or the phrase task force. True. And so there's lots of other things words we can use to describe those particular groups. So consider adjusting.
And I think that's the beauty of what we're doing here with Eve Intersected, right? Mm-hmm. Is sharing our points of view, growing, learning from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So if there's one thing I'm taking out of everything that we've been exposed to thus far, for me, it will be from the OSEG recording. It was something they said where he said, sometimes we silo ourselves and lose sight of what each person we come across within our day brings to the table. Yeah. That was such a profound statement for me, because what he was saying, that what I took from what he was saying is maximize each relational opportunity. Yeah. Don't waste any small measure of your time, and see people for who they are and the inherent goodness that they bring to each situation. Yeah. It was such an open-minded point of view, and that's where I'm going to rest.
I love that.
I'm going to try to make sure that I don't silo myself and that I see people for who they are and I maximize my relational opportunities.
Yeah, incredible. All I'm going to add to that, Kay, is just coming back to your point and Dean's point in the episode, is these are calls to action, doing something. And they're not negotiable. This isn't something that we can decide yes or no we want to do. As a sport organization, as people in this society, we are responsible to act. And so do something. That's the call.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And just adding on to what both Kay and Shannon have said, it's not just an institutional or an organizational thing that has to be applied. Like, the calls to action apply to every single person living in this country and on this nation. And I think it's important to recognize that these experiences aren't, so far out. These are people sitting in classrooms beside you. These are people walking past you in the hallways. They're living their lives just like you do, but with these experiences. And so I think it is a responsibility to learn what you can and to take these calls to action personally.
Period.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this special 4-part series on truth and reconciliation, a collaboration between the podcast Eve Intersected and the Podcast Learning Network at Brock University's Faculty of Humanities.
I'm your co-host, Kay.
And I'm your co-host, Shannon.
And I'm your guest, Ryan.
I'm producer, Allison.
And I'm audio producer, Andrew Camacho. Please check the show notes for links mentioned in each episode, and don't forget to visit our YouTube page where you can find each episode with subtitles at youtube.com/eveintersected. Our theme music is Unstoppable Dance Show by Nexus Sound Studio and Your Black Hoodie by White Records. These tracks are used under Creative Commons Zero license from pixabay.com.